741, he reigned until, this one doesn't show it that well. He reigned, didn't come onto the throne until about 715 or so. But that 741 is a rather significant date because there's something else that happened that was significant about that time. But here's what the book of Kings says about Hezekiah. He was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now, the writer of Kings is very often not saying that sort of thing, but he does say about Hezekiah. Why? He removed the high places, broke the pillars, and cut down Asherah. Now, I did not highlight this part, but I will a little bit later. He also broke in places the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had burned incense to it. It was called the Hushtan. We'll get to that a little bit later. But let's just take a look at this first part here. That he moved the high places and broke down the pillars and cut down the Asherah. I got a nice slide here that shows him destroying the serpent and destroying idols and all the things that were indicative in those verses that he was doing the right thing. But this next slide is a little different. Here is something else that is happening that is really quite significant in terms of Hezekiah, and that there was a great interest in the scriptures. Now, what scriptures are they talking about here? Let's go back to a slide that by this time I hope you have memorized. If you haven't, don't. This tells us a little bit about the Torah. Now, what was the Torah? The Torah was the first 5 books that we have in the Old Testament, often referred to as the books of the law, or often referred to as the 5 books of Moses. When they understood what the Torah really represented in terms of the literature, they found out that the material that we have in the Torah came from 4 very distinct sources, 4 very distinct written sources. Up until about the late 1700s and 1800s, people were still believing that the Torah is quite easy to understand. It was all written by Moses. But then you'd have to deal with a situation that Moses sometimes showed some signs of, well, I wouldn't call it senility, but it's not always consistent. And it was in the late 1700s and the 1800s that people began to recognize that really what we were looking at was a number of different sources, 4 sources. And what are these 4 sources? There's the Yahweh Source. It's designated by J here because this is a German designation. And an Elohim Source. These are stories. These are the kind of stories that we find particularly in the book of Genesis. The stories about Abraham with Sarah, Abraham with Isaac and with Ishmael, and Esau and Jacob. The Bible stories that we're all quite familiar with. We find those both in the Yahweh Source and in the Elohim Source. And they are very often combined into what we would like to regard as our biblical history, telling us about the relationship of the people with their God. These sources in this joint situation were brought down into the Torah after a certain amount of editing. The redactor is the editor, and you notice that J.E. is brought down here after that editing. Deuteronomy is not involved in this at all, other than the fact that Deuteronomy was written at a very specific time for a very specific reason in a very specific way, and it's very well illustrated when we look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy made great use of the information that was available in the Yahweh and the Elohim sources, and from them he divided, the Deuteronomic writer made the first form of Deuteronomy. Certain additions were made later on. This is why we have the Deuteronomy 2, and they are also a part of the Torah. But you'll notice also from this Deuteronomy, there is DH. That designates what? 6 other books, the Deuteronomic histories, are very much associated with this book of Deuteronomy. Right now, we're going to concentrate only on this part of this chart and look at the fact that we got the Yahweh and Yahweh Source, but then ask the question, where does this P source come from and what does it mean? The P source means it's the priestly source. Now, I've mentioned this several times. There are a lot of places that say the priestly source was written at such and such a time. The only thing you can really say for sure is that by the time the Israelites went into exile in Babylon, they did have the priestly source. But there's some very good evidence that some of it was written at a considerably earlier time. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is one of the times when they think the priestly source was written and why it was written and what is the significance of it. And then that priestly source, with its editing, was brought into the Torah. If we leave out Deuteronomy from the Torah, then we have a tetrarch. And the tetrarch is the one that's going to involve J and E and P, and that's all. The Deuteronomy is going to stand by itself as a book by itself. Keep this in mind and look at the fact that right now we're interested in P. What does the priestly source really mean? First, let's take a quick review of what we know about the Yahweh source. The Yahweh source was probably written about the time of King Solomon, around 950 or so BC, during Solomon's best days when he had Solomon's court had a lot of very intelligent people. It was Solomon was regarded as a wise man. It deals largely with the things that happened in the area of Judah, down in the south, and to some extent the things that happened in Jerusalem. But it deals largely with I'll say it. It deals largely with the southern part of Israel. On the other hand, the Yahweh source deals with the northern part. After Solomon, Israel split into two nations. One nation was Judah. Judah and Benjamin were by themselves. The other 10 tribes were to the north. We often refer to them as the 10 tribes of Israel. The 10 tribes of Israel. And what is in the Yahweh source deals with things that are pertinent as far as the people in the north were concerned. Like it says, it deals with traditions concerning the northern kingdom and its heroes, such as Joseph and Joshua. Doesn't say anything here about the priestly source. Why not? Well, we have to find out what the priestly source is and what it may very well be. Remember I mentioned this year 641 when Hezekiah was born? Something happened around 641 that was also significant. And that happened way back here in Nineveh. Unfortunately, nobody draws the map that I'm looking for. Nineveh is right here. It's right in the middle of this area of Upper Mesopotamia, somewhere between it's right off the Tigris River. Nineveh is a part of Upper Mesopotamia. In 641, Tiglath-Pileser started his conquest of the world. That's what he was going to try to do. Sargon had tried it thousands of years before. And he started moving further and further to the west and was able, with a lot of success, and with the success of his son Shalmaneser, to conquer an awful lot of the area in this area. And all of a sudden we find that during Tiglath-Pileser's time, Syria started to build up. But once he gets close to the Mediterranean, there's only one direction left to go, and that is south. Then he went down into Syria. And eventually, guess what? He gets all the way down into Israel. He gets into the area where the 10 tribes are. And we have quite a bit of a history here now, in that the 10 tribes of Israel were conquered by the Assyrians and came under the control of the Assyrians. Let's take a quick look at some of the stuff that's associated with it. The capital city, or the throne city of the 10 tribes, was the city of Samaria. Samaria was actually conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. You can see that the march of the Assyrians was pretty successful. This is only a matter of less than 20 years, and they're already down into Israel. Now, what was significant about the Assyrians is how they handled their conquest. This is just a picture of what it looked like when the city of Assyria was put under siege. What the Assyrians did to make sure that they had control of the area that they had conquered is get the people out of that area. And what they did was they exported, they deported, they exiled thousands and thousands of people of Israel. They exported, here's just a picture of the people being deported, the 10 tribes being deported. Whoops, I think I want one other map here. Where's P? Here is a map that shows where they were deported from. Here is Samaria down in this region here. They were deported back up to the area of Nineveh and then even further into the east. As a matter of fact, the Assyrians were very astute in this regard. They would never deport more than 2 or 3 families in a group because you didn't want to give any of them enough time to be able to form a coalition. They were very successful in this way of getting control. As a matter of fact, for all practical purposes, the Israelites never had control over that territory that we ascribed to Israel, to the 10 tribes of Israel. Other people from the outside were transported into Samaria. They eventually did follow the religion of the people in Israel, but they were not the original Israelites. Well, the people that were watching the Assyrians move across upper Mesopotamia and then moving down south, coming toward Israel, said, hey, it's not a good idea to stay here. Now, a lot of them were deported, but there were a lot of them that did something else. They fled to the south. They said, let's get out of here, let's move south, let's move into Judah. Judah is a different country. There's no indication yet that the Assyrians are going to conquer Judah. So they moved en masse. As a matter of fact, they talk about a big population explosion that took place in the area of Jerusalem and Judah, owing to all of these people that had come from the north. Well, these people that had come from the north not only came as people, but also with what? With their source, with their Yahweh source, with their writings, with their heritage that they had recorded, their written record of their background, of what we call the Elohist heritage. When the Elohist heritage was compared, the Elohist document was compared with the Yahweh's document, and we looked at that when we were looking at the book of Genesis, we find out that very often they overlapped. And you could very easily put the Yahweh's and the Elohist sources together as one source that just tells one thing. It tells about the relationship of the people, of the Israelites, with their God, of the people. If you go back to the history, which we will be covering in some great detail next year, you find out there's another element that has to be considered, and that is part of the society of these Israelites was their temple. Solomon, when he became king, built a temple and started the idea that people should worship in the temple and had a priest assigned to that temple. We are going to talk about that priest so much next year, you'll hear a lot more about him. But just keep in mind that there is Solomon's temple, and all the way from the beginning of the reign of the David dynasty, all the way from the beginning of that reign, there were these people that were priests in the temple. They looked at what was going on, and they said, hey, wait a second. These people are very concerned about themselves as a group of people. But what's really important is the temple. How significant is the temple? And what was decided by them at that time, according to what we read in Hezekiah and Kings about Hezekiah, what was decided that the priests would write their own document. Instead of having a Yahweh's document and Elohim's document combined, let's get our own document, let's get a priestly document, which tells what? Tells us what is significant. And as far as the priests were concerned, what was significant was what? Their religion, their temple, and what was going on in that temple. What was going on in that temple were the sacrifices that were made in that temple, about the holidays and all the other ceremonies that were part of the temple. That's what should be written in that priestly document. Most of the critics of the priestly document say that there's very little question that when these priests sat down, what they did, you got a drink of water, and I'll tell you what they did. What they did is they looked very carefully at what was written in the J and E, what was written in the Yahweh's and in the Elohim's documents. What most of the commentators say is that that priestly document is unbelievably accurate in tracing the history of these people in terms of the relationship, not with God, but what the relationship should be with the temple, and the temple that was in Jerusalem. Very close. Now, I have not done this, but I've mentioned this before. People that read the whole priestly document will tell you this. It is accurate, very accurate. And that the priests, when they were writing this document, knew full well what was in the other two documents. They also challenge anybody to try to read it, because it is as dry as bones. And that's exactly the expression that was used in one of the commentaries I read. It's very dry reading. If we had only the priestly document, we'd be in a little bit of trouble. It's very helpful, and we'll see a little bit later on, probably not today yet, but we'll see a little bit later on. It was a matter of having what was in the Yahweh's and the Elohim's documents that made the Bible what it is today. But the priestly document, as far as the priests were concerned, was enough. But it certainly wasn't enough to make the Bible the great book that it was. Now, I may get back to this a little bit later on. Right now, I want to go back to the conquest that the Assyrians had made to the north, led them, of course, to come down to the south. Now, here is a. If you look down to the south, actually, what we find out is that Libnah, and Lachish were both conquered by the Assyrians, and they were laid to waste. I should mention something, and that is this, that the person that's involved here is not Tiglath-Pileser, not Shalmaneser. Actually, Shalmaneser died about the time that they came to Samaria, as Samaria was actually destroyed by another king called Sargon. Not the Sargon that we had earlier this year. Sargon starts the move to the south into Judah. When he dies, and is taken over by Sennacherib. That's why we call this the Sennacherib trip into Judah. And you notice he comes all the way down to Lachish, and we find that he did conquer Lachish and then goes to Jerusalem. But what happened in Jerusalem is really quite fascinating. He got to Jerusalem and found out that he could not get into the city. Jerusalem went under siege, whereas Sennacherib had been quite successful with some of these other cities in the area of Judah. When they got to Jerusalem, they did not succeed. Part of the reason is that Hezekiah, as the king, could see this movement of the Assyrians coming further and further south, and eventually they would be coming where? Into Judah. And he laid plans for this. Now, we've talked about this many times before in this class. One of the things that he did to make sure that Jerusalem would not suffer under a siege was make sure they had a water supply. And one of the important things that Hezekiah had done was to dig a tunnel called the Hezekiah Tunnel, because he was behind it, dig a tunnel that made it possible for them to get water all the way from the Gihon Spring down here, all the way into interior parts of the city of Jerusalem, made plans so that if they were going to have to undergo siege, hey, this is not going to work out all that badly. Sennacherib does come up there, and he does lay siege on the city. And the city doesn't fall that fast. Actually, the story that we get is a fascinating one. This is in the 14th year, what we're told here is that even though they were under siege, there must have been some negotiations that were going on between Sennacherib and Hezekiah and the people that were in Jerusalem. Because what we're told in these verses that come out of Kings is they stripped as much of the valuable stuff that was available to them, stripped it out and gave it to the Assyrians, hoping what? That the Assyrians would leave. Now, remember a couple of weeks ago I talked about peanuts and Cracker Jack? And that one of the nice things about Cracker Jack is once in a while you'd find a peanut, but you still went back to the Cracker Jack. Finding some correlation between secular history and biblical history in the Bible stories is like finding a peanut in Cracker Jack. Here is one of the best examples that we can find in the Old Testament of where we have a good record in terms of the biblical history, as we find it in the book of Kings. And alongside of that, we have something else, a record that was kept by Sennacherib himself about his success. These were written on his prisms. There are 3 prisms that are available. They are almost identical except they're different. They differ only in a few words, not in meaning or anything like that. They're essentially the same. There are 3 of these prisms that were found. They're very sizable. They're available at various places. If you look at this carefully, you'll notice that the one in the center that seems to be the cleanest is at the University of Chicago. I can vaguely remember going to the Oriental Institute, which was about a block away from where my lab was at the university, and standing looking at that great big block and wondering what the dickens that was. Well, I realize now it was one of the Sennacherib prisms. There are 2 others that are in different positions, different places. I won't go into where they're from. But what is significant is that on these prisms we have really a detailed account of what possibly had happened as far as Sennacherib's journey from the north all the way down into Judah until he gets to Jerusalem. And he even talks about what happens when he gets to Jerusalem. I think I have that. I'm going to read this. On Sennacherib's prism, he says this of Hezekiah. This is a prism now. This is not the Bible. As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with smaller towns, taken in battle by battering rams. I took plunder as plunder, 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels. He was talking about how successful he was. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city in Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him, and I did not allow anyone to come in or out of the city. Well, he's correct. Nobody got into the city and nobody got out. What happened is described here in the book of Kings. I think I'll show you a picture of that actually. What happened during the period of the siege, according to what we have in the book of Kings, the angel of death came in and destroyed Sennacherib's army. I think I have another picture that's even more colorful. The angel of death coming in. And what happened then that was rather significant, namely, Sennacherib had to pick up with what remained of his army that was not killed and move back to Nineveh. And he did. He just pulled out. He stopped the siege. In a way, you have to admit that Hezekiah succeeded in that the city was not taken, and that Sennacherib failed because he did not take the city. What is written in the Sennacherib prison and what is written in the Bible are not exactly the same thing. But it's something that we very often will see, when we can see it, is that two different groups of people will describe the same thing differently. Sennacherib describes it in the way that I had just read. He had made Hezekiah look like a caged bird, even though he destroyed a lot of the others. He took away an awful lot of plunder away from Jerusalem, away from Judah. On the other hand, when you read the book of Kings, it comes out differently, in that although it does admit in the book of Kings that they did have to strip away any of the valuable material that they had in the city of Jerusalem and give it to Sennacherib, it was really the angel of death that drove the Assyrians out. Now, what was this angel of death? A lot of people have speculated about what might have actually happened here that made Sennacherib withdraw his army. One is that they came down with an epidemic of some. Have you heard about epidemics? Same sort of thing. All of a sudden, people in Sennacherib's army were dying at an unbelievable rate, and he decided he had to get away from this place. There is in one of the reports, and it may be in Sennacherib's prison, the fact that in one of the places where they were having trouble with mice chewing up the bowstrings. And it could very well be that there were rodents that got into the camp, and the rodents were spreading some sort of an insect of some sort. At any rate, what was happening is that the Assyrians were dying left and right. And when Sennacherib decided, I got to get out of here. Now, what the Bible says, what King says, is that drove him back to Nineveh, back to where he had come from, where he was assassinated by one of his sons. And that was the end of Sennacherib. Actually, the history doesn't read that way. Sennacherib did go back to Nineveh, but he lived for about another 10 years. Now, you want to listen carefully to what I'm going to say right now. He lived for about another 10 years. Then he was assassinated, and one of his sons by the name of Esarhaddon took over. One of the sons, Esarhaddon, took over. Esarhaddon was the most successful of all the Assyrian emperors. In spite of all the successes that we see that Sennacherib had, Esarhaddon was even more successful. He not only probably got into places in Palestine, but he got into Egypt and actually had conquered way down into the Nile. And under Esarhaddon, you had one of the largest expanses of territory that was under the control of the Assyrians under Esarhaddon. This was the pinnacle of the Assyrian Empire. Now, you've heard me mention that before. When you're at the very top, what's the next direction you go? You go down. And the situation that occurred in Assyria at that time is quite interesting, because Esarhaddon was replaced when he died by his son Ashurbanipal. David was the most successful of the kings that we had of the Israel, of the United Israel. He was followed by Solomon. And what do we remember about Solomon? Solomon in all his glory. Solomon did very well in spending all of the things that David had managed to get together. The same sort of thing happened the same sort of thing happened here in Assyria. They had all the success under Esarhaddon, but when Ashurbanipal came on, he spent like crazy. One of the things that he did is to our benefit, however, is that Esarhaddon was the one that built this library. Remember, we talked about the Ashurbanipal library, in which they later on found over 22,000 plaques of cuneiform telling all about the history of that area. After Ashurbanipal, there were three other emperors, And even though I try to remember their names and try to write them down, I can't, because the whole thing started to fall apart. It fell apart very rapidly. Now, it wasn't only because of the inadequacy of these new emperors, but also what was happening further down in the south plays a very significant role. What was happening further, the Babylonians were coming into power. And it wasn't too long before the Babylonians had moved in and actually conquered the Assyrians. Does that play a very important role in the history of these people? Yes. I'm bringing that up now because later on, when we're going to look at stuff next year, we're going to have to see how some of these things all fit together that lead to the situation that actually does take place as far as what was going on in Israel at that time. But at this point, we're dealing with a situation that Sennacherib did leave. He didn't conquer Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, I think there's something kind of interesting about one of the maps that I have here. Does anybody see, I wish I had the pointer here. Take a look at this map. You see a little yellow place down in here? This is all this green stuff is all under the Assyrians. The Assyrians never got control of Judah. That's why this still is yellow, because they never got control of Judah. That all can change a little bit later. But here is something that I had on the screen before, and I'm going to look at it again. When he was 25 years old, we're told what? Hezekiah came on the throne. What did he do? He did right was the eyes in the sight of the Lord. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But I've changed what's been highlighted. I've changed now. What we had read earlier was that he removed the high places and destroyed all the idols. But now let's take a look at this last little bit. And he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had burnt incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. He destroyed that idol. Well, let's take a little bit of a look at that idol. Where does that come from? We read about this bronze serpent in the book of Numbers. And what we're told here is the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many of the people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, what shall we do? And Moses said to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent, and see it's on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and it was a serpent, and when a serpent bit man, he would look upon the bronze serpent and live. Serpent on a pole. Well, there's probably one of the more familiar pictures of the serpent on a pole. Here's another picture. Anybody recognize that? It's a symbol of what? It's a medical symbol. And what do you see in this medical symbol? Serpents on a pole. And this became almost a habit, that they would refer back to this situation that we had in Numbers, that the serpent on a pole had to deal with what? Healing. It had to deal with medical situations. And what we have here is, well, let me ask you, is this a favorable thing or an unfavorable thing? Well, what did Hezekiah decide to do with it? He decided to destroy it. And yet when we read Numbers, we're given the impression what? We're given the impression that, hey, this was a good thing, that Moses had made this serpent, and that they should look at this serpent and they would be healed. Moses was responsible for the bronze serpent. What we read in the book of Kings that I read to you earlier, that Hezekiah took it upon himself to do what? To destroy that. Does this sound a little bit funny? I think I have a slide here now. I mentioned this to Carl when we were on the phone. I was dealing with the word cult. Now, when you hear the word cult, do you just sort of back up a little bit? Sometimes the word cult has some connotations that aren't always desirable, because there are cults that are very often involved in evil doings. But if you go to the definition of cult, the first one that you find in most of the definitions is what I have here. It's a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. Guess what we find in the Bible? A Moses cult and an Aaron cult. Very strong cults. The Moses cult, we find many bits of evidence in the books of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomic histories. That comprises a good part of the Bible that most of us are quite familiar with. The Aaron cult is largely what we find in the priestly sources that we have in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. A good share of what we have in those 4 books was written by the priests. As a matter of fact, over 51% of those books is devoted to what the priestly sources had to say. And the priestly sources were of the Aaron cult. They were of the Aaron cult. We also find a couple of books that, again, you are familiar with in this regard, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I'll ask you how you're familiar with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because you haven't spent much time with them, and neither have I. We're very, very, very much oriented looking at the Deuteronomic histories. We don't pay that much attention to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I can't remember sermons being preached from 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Part of the reason is that they are history, but they're history that were written in terms of it should be looked at using the Aaron cult methods. In other words, how does Aaron fit into this? Why is Aaron so important? I'll give you just a brief survey of what we can find in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles that is significant. What we find in 1st and 2nd Chronicles are lack of things that we find in the Deuteronomic histories. For example, when the priests were writing the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they did not want to get anything in there that was going to be adverse to what they were trying to get across, and that is the important things were what were taking place in the temple, about the sacrifices that take place in the temple. That was what was important. Let's not talk about David and Bathsheba. What's the best way? Leave it out. Leave it out. Nothing at all in Chronicles about. What about Absalom? About a son rebelling against his father. You know how much of that we find in Chronicles? 0. The chroniclers, the priestly writers that were writing the Chronicles did not want to include those things. They weren't really a part of what the Aaron cult felt was important. What was important to them were things that were associated with the temple, that were associated with the religion, and not all these things that deal with the human condition, as we talk about the fact that people were involved. Let me take a look at another slide I got here. If we go through the history, we find out that the Moses cult and Aaron cult show up, not under those names. When we talk about the Shilohites, we're talking about people that are associated with the Moses cult, the ones that consider Moses as being the important person in the Old Testament. The Mushites, that's a little bit more difficult. Mushite, as I gather, is probably a great-grandson of Moses. And the Mushite must have had a big tribe. And very often, the people that have Moses' descent were regarded as Mushites. Forget what's in the Pharisees. On the other hand, the Aaron cult, the people are often referred to as Aaronites. Well, why not? They were interested in Aaron. But they're also referred to as Zedekites. Zadok is somebody we're going to talk about rather extensively. Those things that I have, that I just mentioned, are not in parentheses, but you notice some things that are in parentheses. Both of these cults show up, interestingly enough, in the New Testament. Only because of some changes that had taken place in the political history, particularly involving the dissolution of the Persian Empire, of the Grecian Empire out of the Romans, that certain things happened, and the Zadokites and Aaronites, or the Aaron cult, suddenly became a group of people that we refer to as the Sadducees. You remember that from the New Testament? Oh yes, the Sadducees are very significant. The Sadducees were the most elite group of people that you found in Israel at that time, or in Judah at that time. Also, in the New Testament, we read about the Pharisees. Now, the interesting thing about the Pharisees is that we regard them as being what? Of the Moses cult. I came across a statement that I find very interesting in this regard, and that is that Phariseeism started with the book of Deuteronomy. If you recall, I just showed you that one of the most important books that we have that refer to the Moses cult is the book of Deuteronomy. This one book that we have in the Torah that doesn't fit with the others. It is part of the Moses cult. And Phariseeism, that is closely following the law, got started as far back as that. One of the interesting things that I found about looking at the New Testament rather carefully in this regard is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees actually get involved in some of the latest history that we have that's recorded in the New Testament. You know what that is? When we find that Paul went to Jerusalem and he was put on trial by the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin at that consisted of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They had to work together. Paul was up before the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Anybody remember what Paul did? Paul decided to start a conversation about the resurrection. Why? Because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, and he started a big argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I imagine what Paul did was stuck out of the side door, and we never heard anything more about it again. But as late as this would have been about 2 or 3 years before the death of Nero, about 65, 70 BC. The Sadducees were very, very much in tune to the temple. As a matter of fact, the Sadducees were a part of the most elite group that we had in Jerusalem or in Judah. They included not only the wealthy people, but all the people that were priests, that were part of the priesthood. This was a very significant part and they were also the wealthiest. The archaeologists say that if they come across any signs of real opulence in Jerusalem, usually it can be ascribed to the home of some Sadducee. The Sadducees did another thing that we find was true all the way back to the very beginning of the Aaron cult, is that the Aaron cult and the Aaronites and the Zadokites were always very close to the king, very close to royalty, because they had to depend on some political support to see to it that the temple existed. The best political report would be protection would be the king. By the time you get to the New Testament era, what do we find the Sadducees? The Sadducees are always sitting with whom? They're sitting with the Roman governors. They're good friends with the Roman governors. Same situation. The Sadducees and the Aaron cult were always very close to the throne or very close to the ruling power. They also had something else, and that is, for the most part, not entirely, until we get to the New Testament, they were always Levites. But after the New Testament, there were some that were not Levites. As far as the Pharisees, people could become Pharisees or could become of the Moses cult without being a Levite. Samuel was not a Levite, he was from Ephraim. Gideon was from Ephraim. David was from Judah. A lot of people that were part of the Moses cult were not Levites, whereas the Aaron cult back in Old Testament times were very much what we might have to refer to as the, the Aaron cult. Now, let me ask you a question, answer you very truthfully. Are you confused? Yes, you bet. This is a very confusing situation, to say the very least. I'll give you just one quick thing here. This all came about in one day, probably in only one afternoon, of something that happened in the history of the Israelites that changed everything, that developed these two cults. Developed these two cults that played a significant role in how very much of the Bible was written and put together, played a very significant role when we get to the New Testament. All happened in one afternoon. I'll tell you what that afternoon is, and then I got one more statement to make after that. That afternoon was the afternoon that Solomon was made the king of Israel. When Solomon was made the king of Israel, it took place in an afternoon. Adonijah should have been made king, but Solomon was made king. Why did that happen? We find out that it can be explained if we know something about the history of the Israelites that goes all the way back to when they were in Egypt. As a matter of fact, it was history that played everything to a situation where bang, all of a sudden on this one day, something happened and everything changed. This really struck me when I was in a situation, as some of you may know, I was confined in a nursing home. I was in a nursing home on December the 7th, and I saw a lot of television. One of the things that struck me is that I can remember, how many of you can remember December the 7th? Some of you can. Okay. I can remember the morning of December the 7th, riding to church with my father and my Aunt Lou and my mother and my brother. And my father and Aunt Lou were talking about the war in Europe, about the Nazis trying to get into Russia and the problems the Nazis were having when they were getting into Russia, and about the war in Europe. Not a thing was said about Japan. We went to church. The war was in Europe. Why be concerned about Japan? That's a Pacific Ocean away. That afternoon, my family on my mother's side was having a reunion. My Uncle Smitty had a car with a radio. He was a radio man. And Uncle Smitty came into the gathering and said, guess what? The Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. And one day, folks, the world changed completely. And one day, within 3 days, we were in declared war against Germany. We were in declared war against Japan. And one day this happened. On the other hand, watching enough of these programs pointed out that the war in Germany did not happen one day in 1939. It took over 20 years after the Versailles Treaty for things to build up for history to become a real problem. And it did become a problem until Hitler started to move. The problem in Japan, this is my own conclusion, I may be jumping the gun. The problem in Japan all arose historically when the first person fired up an internal combustion machine. You know why? Because Japan had no oil. It had no oil at all. So as far back as the early part of the 1900s already, Japan, if it wanted to be a world power, was going to have to do something about the fact that on their little islands they did not have oil. And they had their eyes on what? Southeast Asia and the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. Again, it was a whole lot of history that all built up to one day, December the 7th. The same thing is true when we take a look at some of the biblical history. how things build up to a point where all of a sudden, on that one day when David was dying, Solomon was made king, and the whole world changed, and everything in terms of what we have in the Bible and in terms of the history of the Israelites were affected by that one day. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and we'll see you in January.